One, test, 1, 2. Test, 1, 2.
I figure I can turn it on.
Go. How's everybody doing tonight? So great to see you. I'm going to start off the way I started last week. Thank you for coming. You know, this is a hobby of mine. Well, it's not entirely a hobby. Also, it's my job. But I could really come in here and not do a thing on Wednesday night that takes me a long time to study for, too. But this is really a joy of mine and a passion, because I grew up in church, and I grew up hearing a lot of different theories, and I would read the book of Revelation. I don't know, but my eyes would get this big, and I'd try to figure out what it's talking about. So I was always told it was a prediction of the end times or the future. So it is kind of about, all apocalypses are about the end of an age. But you have to realize, in the Jewish literature, in the Jewish culture, the ages went in cycles. It wasn't just like there was one beginning and then one end. They went in cycles. So every time, like at the turnover of something, there was a major upheaval. And so an apocalypse is kind of, I'm working on this definition and getting it better every time, is a prophetic work of art in response to a national trauma. So it is, it's not just in fact, it may have predictions of in the future as well, but the purpose of it is to reframe what we just went through and where we are, and with the spiritual meaning. And so when I was growing up, the default, and I think for a lot of churches, even still today, the default theory is the dispensational theory. A couple of weeks ago, I went through kind of all the history of those theories, and it started in about the 1850s. But for my generation, it started with this book. It started with this book called The Late Great Planet Earth. How many have ever read this book? Anybody? Raise your hand. I see about a third of you, right? Or at least you're familiar with it. Hal Lindsey was the author of it, and he was very much, it had been through the 60s, and now it's 1970, and people were really interested in this thing. We had Vietnam, we had total upheaval in our country. By the way, right about the time, ironically, that Don McLean wrote American Pie. So believe it or not, there were two apocalypses, right? A fantastical explaining. But if you'll notice what the title is, oh, you can't see it. It's how Scripture, prophecies from the Bible that speak to our generation. And so he took it, rather than as from a historical, he took it as a futurist thing. Like, this verse in the Bible predicts this verse predicts this. And I reread it last week. I always read, whenever I'm studying on a topic, I'm not really satisfied until I've read all the sides. So I spend a lot of time reading books that I don't agree with. I don't know if you've ever done that. When people were going through COVID, people would email me and say, Pastor Mike, you need to do more research. I said, there's nobody does more research than I do. And by research, what they meant is read the internet until you find a website that agrees with you. That was their research. And so I always want to read, and I went back. I don't know if I ever completely read this book, but I knew all the theories of it from youth group and growing up in church and stuff. And so I read through. It's an easy read, by the way. I'm not telling you not to read it. There's a lot of stuff in there, and the only problem I have with it was everything in it is wrong. So I'm just saying, other than that, it's a perfectly fine book. And I say that, I'm glad you're all giggling, because I say that kind of to make you laugh. But regarding the prophecies, I do kind of think that, but there's also places in there that show you how to give your heart to the Lord. And I have a friend that came to know the Lord through that book and stuff. So it's not like everything in it was wrong-spirited. And I don't think Al Lindsey had ill intentions. But if I can give you a for example, we'll say, you know how Daniel talks about the king from the north? Yeah. So Daniel is about the Maccabean War, right? But just forget, Daniel is now, it's a prediction of what's going to happen in the 70s, right? And you know how, well, what's more north than the Soviet Union? And then he would quote 5 experts on what a threat the Soviet Union is. Well, we knew that, right? Therefore, Daniel predicted the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is the one that's going to bring about Armageddon. Any problem with that logic? Is that it's just assuming the king of, because it's in the north and it says king of the north. So one of the problems I have with it is, when people use the Bible like it's a wild card, like it's a fortune cookie, something good is going to happen to you tomorrow. It's so vague that you could make it say anything, and that's the scary part. And then you go on to say, how in the Revelation there's a beast that has 10 horns, right? What else has 10 heads? Europe. And they were trying to get together after World War II, and he predicted that this coalition is going to be from whence the Antichrist comes. And obviously, Titus was the general that destroyed Jerusalem the first time. And so obviously the Antichrist is going to be Jewish as well, and he's going to be Roman, but the Roman Empire doesn't exist, but there is a country called Romania. Are you following me? So the Bible predicts that the Antichrist is from Romania, and he's going to have blue eyes and blonde hair. And then that's it. Next chapter. He talks about, how in Revelation it says there's kings that are going to come from across the Euphrates? What else is across the Euphrates? Communist China. So there's a whole chapter called the Yellow Peril. Forget about how racist that is just for a minute. But of course, communist, and then 5 experts on how dangerous communist China is, let alone the fact that the president just got back from there. But, and the other one, and it says in Daniel in one place, and when he comes down, that Cush will be in submission to him. Well, Cush is the ancient word for Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is where all of the African people came from. And so that must mean that the whole continent of Africa is also going to join in the Antichrist coalition. So now you have the yellow people, you have the brown people, you have the European people, the Russian people. All you have left is at the end of the day that Jesus is going to return for the white Anglo-American Protestant people that live in the United States. And the rest of the world is going to be destroyed. And it's based on not very good logic or Bible reading. Are you with me? So if you still have some of that, I want to encourage you, if the way that I'm teaching it, by the way, I'm very eclectic. I'm not really held into an ism. I really try to understand what did the original audience hear. So here's one of the maps, by the way, in Late Great Planet Earth. So you can see there's amphibious assault here, and it comes down from the north and attacks Egypt and comes right through the land of Israel. And look, there's a map about what's going to happen in the future, let alone the fact that the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, right? And he said all of the communist bloc countries behind the Iron Curtain, neither of which exists anymore, they're all going to be a part of the coalition with Russia. And so now we know that many of those former Soviet nations are now a part of NATO. So if they go to war, we go to war. So there's just a lot of, the problem is the things predicted in that book did not come to pass, which leads me back to just a question, not a dogmatic statement, but what if not the book of Revelation? Because an apocalypse is told to speak to the generation that was just traumatized. And so before we can apply it to our lives, we have to figure that out. And so do you see what it says? Can anybody read? I didn't bring my glasses. It says this is Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 through 42. That's what it says. That represents this line right here, and it says that the Soviet Union is going to come down and invade with its coalition. That's what Daniel says. Let's read what Daniel says, can we? All right. No, he says, at that time of the end, now granted, he says this is at the time of the end, but remember, the time of the end in the book of Daniel was the end of the Maccabean revolt, which ended about 168. And so at the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. Now, could you imagine the Russians coming with chariots and cavalry? This is actually one of those places people say you should take the Bible more literally. So I'm just going to read. There's actual chariots and cavalry. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land, which he did get this one. Beautiful land is Israel. It's a metaphor. Many countries will fall, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand, and he will extend his power over many countries, and Egypt will not escape. And so, by the way, those 3. Edom, Moab, and Ammon did not survive after the Romans. Those countries did not exist anymore. And so this could not be a prophecy about the future. Edom and Ammon don't exist anymore. There still is in Egypt, but they were a part of the peace accords with Hamas. So, I mean, they're on our side. And so there is another way of looking at this that isn't about predicting the future. And it takes a little bit of elbow grease. It takes a little bit of study. You got to get in and read. And by the way, I don't make any of this stuff up. Read a little bit of Polybius, one of the ancient historians that tells us about what happened between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So in the time of that war, the Seleucids, 4 of Alexander the Great's generals, took over the Greek Empire. And the area that is Syria, where Israel is, was occupied by the Seleucids, and Egypt was occupied by the Ptolemies, named after those 2 generals. Now, many generations and many wars. So the king of Syria is the king of the north. The king of the south is the king of Egypt. And one of the wars that is towards the end, that the last conflict that led up to the Maccabean revolt was called the Sixth Syrian War. And so the king of the south was Ptolemy IV of Memphis, who was very young and was mentored by another man at the same time. The king of the north is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is the original Antichrist, who was the one that originally desecrated the temple, the desecration of desolation was him setting up a statue of Zeus in the temple. But that doesn't come yet. This war, mainly his goal was to come down and to take over Egypt from the Ptolemies. So it was 2 Greek factions fighting against each other. And he comes down in 168 BC. He takes over Cyrus and occupies Memphis for a second time. And the Roman Senate dispatches Gaius Populus to defend Alexandria, which is also up in northern Africa. And the weird thing is, Gaius Populus was good friends with Antiochus Epiphanes IV. It's like they were college buddies. They knew each other. So the Roman Senate sent down there to talk sense into Antiochus and get him to leave Egypt alone, because he was fixing to take it. And so then Populus, he goes down. There's this great story in Polybius. I mean, there's great detail. If you're into this. He went down around Antiochus, and he says, you need to withdraw or Rome is going to war with you. And he says, all right, give me some time to think about it. And he says, no, and he takes a stick and he draws a line around him. And he says, don't leave that circle until you give me your answer. And he looked at, thought about it, and he just knew he could not handle a war against Rome. And so he said, all right, and he departed, and he was so angry when he went back up into Israel, which was his territory, where he had just appointed a new high priest of his own choosing. They had kicked out his high priest and put their own in. And the historian Josephus tells us Antiochus went crazy. He ended all the sacrifices. He forbid them to circumcise their children. He would kill their children if they circumcised them. He just had a reign of terror. He would sacrifice pigs on the altar because it was unclean to them, force them to eat it. And it was just a reign of terror, and it started the Maccabean War. And so what is Daniel talking about? He's talking about a king in the south comes down, and then he goes crazy, and he comes back in, and he says, and he kills many. But we have in the history books what this trauma was. How many are with me so far? So one of the questions you have to ask in identifying what is this particular apocalypse, and what was the trauma that it is addressing? And so there's at least 5. I've shown this chart before. This is an updated version. There's at least 5 main traumas in the Bible. There are more, which spans Old Testament to New Testament. There's 5 main ones. There's other minor ones as well, but the ones that created 5 of the greatest apocalyptic seasons. So an apocalypse is that work of art that's dreamlike and it's in images and stuff. The first one was the Assyrians when they conquered the northern kingdom. And so for many of the northern 10 tribes, they were lost forever, other than maybe a few remnants that survived it. But the northern kingdom was destroyed. And this is a little too early for an apocalypse, but there's little bits and pieces of the book of Isaiah that are apocalyptic. But the book of Revelation quotes a lot of stuff from Isaiah and Micah and Isaiah, which was about that time, about the destruction of Israel. The second one happened in 586 BC. The Babylonians conquered the Assyrians. And so Judah became a vassal of Babylon. And that means they paid tribute. It was like living in a neighborhood with a mafia boss, right? You paid them money and they left you alone. And at one point in their history, Hezekiah, the king, stopped paying the tribute. So Nebuchadnezzar came down, laid siege to the city, and eventually destroyed it, deported the population into Babylon, and burnt the first temple down to the ground and destroyed the walls. Very traumatic. So that was another ending. And so prophecies like Joel, which is where we get the stars falling from the sky and the moon was turned blood, and blow the trumpets. We're going to start with that tonight. Blow the trumpets in Zion comes from Joel. It was about the invasion of the Babylonians. And he destroys the temple once and for all. So Joel and Jeremiah, who was a prophet just before and after the invasion of the Babylonians. In fact, Jeremiah told the Israelites, you need to submit to the Babylonians or they'll destroy you. And nobody listened. And then Ezekiel is a prophecy during the exile from Babylon. But in some of his visions, he'll go back in his vision and travel back to the time when the temple is still standing and have visions about all the evil things that the priests did. We talked about that last week. Anyway, the third one, well, so the Persians conquered the Babylonians, which was a good thing for the Israelites. So I don't know if you could actually call this a trauma, but King Cyrus of Persia sent them back into the promised land. And so they became a nation again, just like they did it in 47. And so that in particular wasn't traumatic, but there's an apocalyptic book called Zechariah that talks about the trauma of what they had just gone through and who they are now. And so there's a lot of apocalyptic visions. By the way, the book of Revelation quotes from all of these apocalypses. But each one of them, you have to understand the history behind them. Most of the time, the history is in the Bible that we have. Some of the times, there's history outside of the Bible that tells us another aspect of it. The third one was, Alexander the Great takes over the entire world in just a few years and then dies young. For a while under the Greeks, Israel had peace until that war that I just mentioned. In 168, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and because of that whole thing of not being able to take Egypt and then coming back and going crazy on the Jews form an army under Judah Maccabee, which means Judah the Hammer. And he became he's the George Washington of that second generation. And they fight back against the Greeks and defeat them. Rededicate the temple, that's what Hanukkah is, lighting the menorah again. And they established the kingdom of Israel for about 100 years. The only 100 years in all of this Old Testament history that Israel was never under an empire. So they had self-rule. The book of Daniel has a bunch of pictures. Now, if you've read Daniel, the setting of Daniel is way back in old Babylon. But the stories and the prophecies in Daniel are about the Maccabean War. So it's like writing a bunch of visions during the Second World War that's actually about the First World War. And so in visions, you can time travel like that. Part of how it gets, and how does this make it into the late great planet Earth, all of this stuff from Daniel? Because in his vision at night, he travels back in time and then sees that war coming as if it's a future event. And so it's this kind of apocalyptic thing that you could do with your vision. And so people say, well, that proves it's prophetic because he predicted every king that was going to come. No, he could predict that because he'd already seen all that happen. Does that make sense? It's not being deceptive. It's just something you do in an apocalypse. You can travel back in time. You can travel to different locations and then prophesy about it. And then in 70 AD, I told you the story already about how the Jews of that time began to rebel against the Roman occupiers. So Judea was a Roman province. This wasn't a separate country by now. It was autonomous for about 60 years until about 65 or 63. I can't remember, I have to look it up. But the Romans came in and took over, and it became part of the Roman Empire. And so all the little, that used to be kingdoms around them, like Edom became Idumea, the province, and Judah, used to be Judah, became the province of Judea. So now it's just a province of the Roman Empire. So they were under Roman rule, and they rebelled. And this major war broke out, where they ended up sending 3 of their 30 legions to come down and to quell the rebellion and put it down. And it ended in the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the second temple, never to be rebuilt, and the ending of Old Testament Judaism. And what was birthed out of that was this new thing called the church, which is Messianic Jews mixed in with some Hellenized people. So these are the traumas, right? It's in response to a trauma to explain, here's what we just went through, and just like American Pie, here's some poetic imagery that represents the emotion of what we just went through. So like stars falling from the sky, that's what it felt like. It felt like the whole world was over, right? But it's to express the emotion of that. And the purpose of all of these apocalypses is to encourage people. It's to give them courage. That just as God was with us in this whole, and God is in charge of it, He's going to be in charge of it today too. You don't have to be afraid. And so one of the reasons that I like to go back and rethink about the book of Revelation is because for a lot of people, when they read Revelation, it makes them afraid. Fills them with fear. Oh my goodness, this is what's going to happen. And then, well, thank goodness there's a pre-trib rapture. And then you find out, but you know, the book of Revelation never mentions the rapture. And that word in particular is not even in the Bible. There's verses that talk about something like that, but at least we're going to get out of it. And people come out with another theory. No, we're going to live through the tribulation and then get raptured. And then you're like, oh no, that's worse. And it brings fear. And then everybody argues and no one can agree with it because nobody is reading history. Kevin had a question back there.
So what was Jesus' lifetime?
Jesus' lifetime was, Kevin says, when was Jesus' lifetime? Somewhere around 5 to 6 BC. No, he was not born in 0. The clock calendars are off by a little bit. Somewhere around 5 or 6 BC to around 30 AD. And nobody knows an exact date, but that's the best guess. And so so he dies in about 30, and about 40 years later, Jerusalem is destroyed. But Jesus prophesied about it. He says, you see these stones? Not one of these is going to be left on another. Yeah, good question. Anybody else? And so, why I say an apocalypse is important to the generation that just went through that trauma. Are you with me? They're still carrying it. The people living up in Asia Minor, up in Turkey, the 7 churches of the book of Revelation, many of them were alive when the war took place. They were Holocaust survivors. And the book of Revelation is written to people that have been traumatized, either them or their parents or their grandparents, and their roots and their culture had been destroyed, and they're trying to figure out, now what do we do? And the book of Revelation is written to encourage them. And even if we suffer persecution under the Romans, don't worry, God's in charge, and it's all going to be okay. But he begins to tell this story. And so, any questions about that? I just thought I'd start with a rabbit trail rather than just jumping right into the book. But does that make sense? Do you have this in mind? If nothing else, you don't have to memorize this whole chart, but just when I'll refer back to these passages, when I go back, I try to think, it's hard to understand what those other apocalypses are talking about unless you kind of think about what war they're talking about or what conflict they're talking about. Then you can say, okay, now I know what it's talking about. And he goes back and he uses the prophetic images and symbols from previous wars to apply them to their present trauma. So is there anything about this that has to do with us today? Well, they recycled the prophecies. So, of course, some of them, when it's about conflicts in the world and God being ultimately in charge, of course that applies. The problem is they're too vague and open to interpretation to be absolutely certain about things, to try to predict the future. That's not what they were written for. They were written in response to things. So we can take general principles from it and apply it to our lives today. But you want to get into Revelation 8? By the way, you don't want to miss next week. Teaser. One of my favorite new revelations, and I just mean that I learned, a connection I learned, happens in Revelation chapter 9. So why didn't you bring that one tonight, Pastor Mike? Oh, this one's good too, but I can't wait. I already told Mark about it. Isn't it cool? Okay, don't tell anybody. All right. Yes?
What did Hal Lindsey do before he wrote that book?
Don't know. He asked me, what did Hal Lindsey do before he wrote the book? I don't know how Lindsey's listen, by the way, nothing I share about history or about Polycybus or quoting Josephus and stuff, I want to tell you, the wonderful thing about back in the 70s when people read this book, they didn't have the internet. If he says, and literally there's sentences like, the book of Daniel predicted that Russia would invade, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, Daniel didn't, Russia didn't exist yet. And so we didn't have the internet to look all this stuff up. You can look up every verse in the Bible, you can click on it, find out the Greek word. If you want to read about the Sixth Syrian War, Wikipedia it. You'll get close enough. What happened in the Sixth Syrian War? And there's little, and if you really want to read the original sources, click on the bibliography and go read it. So absolutely nothing that I'm telling you in this whole series is like, just take my word for it. I'm smart. I know what I'm talking about. Don't do your own research. I'm not saying, check my math. If you say, no, that wasn't Antiochus IV, that was Antiochus V, fine, I'll correct my notes. But feel free to check my math and feel free to read the Bible. How's that? All right. Here it starts in Revelation chapter 8. It says, and when they opened the seventh seal, do you remember a couple chapters that the one like the Son of Man, which we think is a vision of Jesus in heaven, going up to the throne of God and receiving a scroll that has 6 seals, or 7 seals. It's like a wax seal that closes it. So this is like the unveiling of a prophecy. And the 7th one, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. So here's this thing. Habakkuk uses this technique. Zechariah does. This is kind of it's the calm before the storm, right? It's that spot right before the two gunfighters fight that everything slows down. You're wah, wah, wah. This is that wait, and everybody has a glint in their eyes. So we're waiting now. What's going to happen next? And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And so variously, these 7 trumpets and 7 angels, 7 is a very popular number, not just in the Bible, all throughout the ancient world. It's baked into creation because there's about 7 days in a week. And a week is a fourth of a moon phase. So 7 is always all around. But these 7 angels, at some point, they're the 7 angels of the churches, and they're the 7 angels that are in heaven. And now they're the 7 angels with the trumpets. I don't know if you can tell from the background. Oh, I kind of faded it out a little bit. That's a picture in the background of all the Roman trumpets from the from the movie Ben-Hur, when they had that triumphal entry. What we learned from Josephus is the Romans used trumpets for everything. In fact, he was a Jewish general and then switched sides when his army fled and got killed. And one of the things, even when he was a Jewish army, because his army was farmers and teachers and carpenters and with pitchforks, and if they had weapons, it's because they picked them up. He looked over at the Romans and he said, man, these are professional soldiers. You've seen movies about them, right? They had uniforms and armor, siege ramps, sword. Each of them had 2 swords and a shield, and they had trumpets, and they had trumpets for everything. Trumpets to get up, trumpets to pack up your tent, trumpets to time to move out, trumpets to attack the city, just like they did back in the cavalry. Remember the trumpet signals? Okay, what's this one mean? I did it terrible, but what does it mean? Yeah, charge. You've seen it in the movies, or you've been to a ball game, one of the two. That was their trumpet signal. So the Romans had signals for everything. And so this idea of the signals, this is talking about, all right, I'll skip to the end even before I prove the case, that in the case of Revelation, The blowing of these trumpets is the beginning of the Roman-Jewish war. I'm going to talk about these two guys a little bit, but I already had enough of a rabbit trail tonight. But when Nero found out about the rebellion in the spring of 67, not 1967, the original one, in the spring of 67, he sends Vespasian, who is one of his old veteran generals that has no political aspirations. So he says, all right, this guy won't be a threat if he gets to. He sends him with the 15th Legion, and he sends Titus, his son, from Corinth down to Alexandria to get the 10th and the 5th Legion, and they come up around through Egypt and join them in Ptolemy's. That's all coming next week. And I'll have maps, real maps from what it actually happened. But they used trumpets. And so this is just, okay, so here's Josephus talking about when they finally attacked the city. Josephus was a Jewish general during the Jewish war who got captured and then became Vespasian's translator and the recorder of history of this war. And so he says, now when the trumpeters of the several Roman legions sounded together and all their army made a terrible shout, and the darts, as by order, flew so fast that they intercepted the light. So it's just one of these occasions where Josephus is telling, they didn't do anything without trumpets. When a trumpet happens, something bad is going to happen. You with me? So each one of these trumpets is in Revelation is doo, 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 and then this happened. And it's kind of a little bit of mixing in. He mixes in a lot of metaphor and a lot of mythology with some actual clues to real things. He uses kind of all of them. He uses poetry, mythology, and then every once in a while ties it into something that they would know exactly what it is. Another angel came and stood over the altar having a golden censer. A censer is something that holds incense. If you grew up Orthodox or Catholic, you've probably seen it, the things they swing, right? And much incense was given to him. In Leviticus, it describes the worship in the temple, and there was even an altar of incense that was before the throne. So the scene is the throne room in heaven, right, that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks. And it's based on the imagery of the temple when it was there. And so much incense was given to them that he should add it to the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar, which was before the throne. So here's the incense. So he says the incense of the prayers of the saints. So this is all the people of God that had been praying, oh Lord, how long till you avenge us? How long till you make it, we're being attacked, and how long till you make it right? And he says all their prayers became like incense on the altar, which is what that symbol was. The incense was smoke that would rise up into Yahweh's nostrils, and it was kind of an interesting way to talk about prayer. We don't do that. We call it we're pretty Protestant. We call it all the bells and smells, right? But I think it's kind of cool. I don't know. I went to a Greek Orthodox wedding several years ago, and they had the censers everywhere. Anyway, just a symbol. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints. So Psalm 141 says, let the lifting of my hands be as the evening sacrifice, and let it be set before you like incense. So, and it went up before God out of the angel's hands. And the angel took the censer, I love this part, and he filled it with the fire of the altar, and he threw it on the land. So catch this symbol. So you follow me? What is the incense? It's the prayer of the suffering saints, saying, when are you going to avenge us? And this angel scoops up those incense coals, which are the prayers, and he takes it and throws it on the land. And it's just like, wow, what a great picture. This is one of the most amazing metaphors of prayer changes things. Are you with me? And so what's going to happen is a major attack and destruction on the land of Israel, and it's in response to the saints that had suffered. And so that the early church, they had several enemies. One was the Romans. Another was the high priesthood, who would put them to death and persecute him. And the other was the Herods, who were the client kings of Judea, So when Jesus was crucified on that night, he was brought before Herod Antipas, he was brought before Ananias, the high priest, and he was brought before Pontius Pilate. That was the three-headed monsters that they fought. And so this judgment is not upon the believers. This judgment is upon the persecutors of the believers. Are you with me? And so this is the beginning of the Jewish war. You can read all about it in the works of Josephus, which you can find online or you can buy for 91 cents on Kindle. And it's not even that long. But where you're going to be looking is in book 2, 3, and 4. And you can read all of this story. So, oh wait, did I not get it? It says, and the angel and threw it on the land. And you notice, I used the word land because NIV usually uses the word earth. But NIV is published by Zondervan, who also published The Late Great Planet Earth. So that book sold 30 million copies starting in 1970. And they came out with the NIV in 1977. And so there's a little bit of, when NIV goes to translate the word that means land, that word can either be translated as land or earth. It says earth because it's connecting it with the end times, but the word really means, I would translate it land, because a lot of this was about the Jews and their connection to the land. You with me? The flood comes and wipes out the land. All right. It says and what followed is thunders and sounds and lightnings and an earthquake. And yes, lightnings is plural, just like it is in the book of Exodus when Yahweh descends on Mount Sinai to deliver the commandments. All of that, the thunders and the lightnings and the sounds and the rumbling and the earthquake, that's all from the book of Exodus when Yahweh comes and visits them. And it's very fearful and frightful. So God is arriving. Are you with me? He's coming in all of his power. And the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Here's the first one. The first one, and by the way, I often say this, if it's offensively, it's a trumpet like that. If it's defensively, these sirens are like consecutive air raid sirens. So think, it's fearful. Run for your lives, guys. And it says, and there followed hail. Where else have we seen the judgment of hail? Do you remember that was one of the 7 plagues in Egypt? When God sent 10 plagues. Now, not all the plagues of Egypt are going to be in this passage, but several of them are. And so much so where it's hard to ignore the connection, right? This is just like God brought the plague of hail, just like God brought these plagues on Egypt to set the children of Israel free. God is also now repeating that judgment on Jerusalem and on Israel that launches the early church. And so this judgment is upon the persecutors of the early believers. And fire mixed with blood, just remember that phrase, would you? Fire mixed with blood, because it's kind of unique, don't you think? I'm going to come back to it in a second. And they were thrown onto the land. And 1/3 of the land was burnt up. He's going to use 1/3 a lot. What is the significance of 1/3? I have no idea. Other than just it's another natural occurring number in heaven. But I found in Ezekiel and in Zechariah, 2 other apocalypses, it talks about 2/3 of the people were destroyed or 1/3. This is just a way of saying this wasn't a final destruction. This is kind of what Jesus calls the birth pains, the beginning of the war. And so for the first 3 years or so, the war was mostly confined to Galilee in the north. And the first campaign that Vespasian, he went throughout the north, and there were several sieges and several wars. And he just wiped out the northern country of Galilee. And this is long before they went down, and in the last half of the war, focused on the city of Jerusalem itself, the walled city. So the first part of the war is up in the north. It said, and a 1/3 of the trees were burnt up, and all of the green grass was burnt up. And so this is a judgment. One of the things that they do in war, by the way, is burn all the trees so that you don't have anything for firewood, so that you don't have anything to make siege ramps. The Assyrians, when they came through, when they left, they cut every tree to the ground. So this was just kind of, in Vietnam, we used Agent Orange to do the same. It was a similar kind of an idea. We call it scorched earth, right? So that's what's happening in the first part of this war. Here's Josephus's version about the raids in the first part of what happened up in Galilee. He said, nor do the Romans, out of anger that they had off of this attempt, that is, the Jewish army tried to take one of their coastal cities and were repelled. Joppa. I'm 98% sure it was Joppa. Anyway, and either by night or by day, burning the places on the plain and stealing away the cattle that were in the country, and killing whatsoever appeared capable of fighting perpetually, and leading the weaker people as slaves into captivity, so that Galilee was all over filled with fire and blood. I read that and I said, come on, that's even just too close. He's even just using the imagery of fire and blood. So lest you think, oh, it wasn't that big of a war. No, it was devastating. So that whole region was just completely overwhelmed by, the Romans did not go in there to just maybe see if they could win. They went in there with 3 legions and other client kings joining in it. Josephus says by the time they were done, they had about 60,000 of professional soldiers and cavalry. And so it was complete devastation. And then the second angel sounded, and something like a great burning mountain, remember that one, another interesting phrase, and was thrown into the sea, and 1/3 of the sea became blood. So remember in Egypt, when he put his staff in the water and the water became blood? So it's recalling, it's quoting back from a previous story out of Exodus now. So this is a second one. First we had the hail, and now we have the blood. This is kind of symbolic of what the land of Israel experienced was the same thing the land of Egypt did. And first it was to set the Israelites free, and now it was basically to start the early church. And 1/3 of the living creatures which were in the sea died. I'm always looking for little clues too where some of this imagery ties into the, what do you call it? The zodiac, yeah. Which was in Hellenistic Judaism, still something that they would have understood the connections to some of these things. And which were in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. And so Josephus says about the destruction of the temple. When he saw, so this is at the end of the war, when he saw the temple going up in flames, he said, for one would have thought that the hill itself, which on the temple stood, was seething hot as to be full of fire on every part of it, and that the blood was larger in quantity than the fire, and those that were slain were more in number than those who slew them. For the ground did nowhere appear visible for the dead bodies that lay on it. Devastating. And so he says when you were far off and you saw the temple burning, you would have thought that the whole mountain on which it sits was on fire. And so there's a couple of places you can have dual mountain, but a burning mountain that gets tossed into the sea it's also used elsewhere in prophetic visions, but it's hard for me not to see a connection with that. Oh, and then he says, and then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from the sky, burning like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of waters. So the zodiac sign for the water bearer is Aquarius. So, so a star falling from the sky. Ezekiel has a prophecy about Babylon. It's very mysterious. People think it's kind of trying to talk about Satan, but he talks about the king of Babylon being like a morning star, and he says, oh, you've fallen from the sky. So this image of, it's just kind of like the fall of an empire or the fall of an authority structure. It could be, you could fill in here, it could be about the fall of the high priesthood, but it had something to do with something coming to an end, right? And the name of the star is called wormwood, and 1/3 of the waters became wormwood. And many people died from the waters because they were made bitter. The word wormwood doesn't show up in NIV. It's in the King James Bible in Jeremiah. It says, therefore, thus says the Lord of armies concerning the prophets, behold, I will feed them with wormwood and make them drink the water of gall. For from the prophecies of Jerusalem is ungodliness gone forth into all the land. And so this whole cycle and this use of language like that, I'm going to feed the armies with wormwood. Wormwood is, so far as we can guess, it's like absinthe, some kind of a poisonous bitter herb. And so he takes it from a prophecy about, I'm going to feed your armies with wormwood. And now in the apocalypse of John, wormwood becomes the name of this giant meteor that's going to come. And what it stands for, I don't know. This is all, you could try to attach all these things to actual things, like catapults, with giant stones and stuff like that, but it would all be just guessing. Go back and watch Lord of the Rings and watch all the ways that they killed one another, right? You could picture how all of these could just be, all of these are just spiritual metaphors for this terrible war that's breaking out in the land. Yeah? All right. The fourth angel sounded, and 1/3 of the sea was struck, and 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars, so that 1/3 of them would be darkened. And so, remember, darkness was one of the 10 plagues in Egypt. And so, on the day, and the day wouldn't shine for it 1/3 of it, which would be a very nice day in Oregon. And the night in the same way. But listen to this, and if you have our time taking these things as metaphor and symbols, how do you darken 1/3 of the sun? You what? An eclipse, but partial eclipse where you can see it. And a 1/3 of the moon, well, that's an easy one. How do you darken 1/3 of the stars? I guess with the clouds, and that 1/3 of them, and then it would only shone for 1/3 of it, 1/3 of. These are symbolic things that just means this was a really, really dark day, and terrible things were happening, and it's not too much different than the stars falling from the sky. By the way, a few chapters earlier, didn't all the stars fall from the sky? So now what's being darkened, right? So these are metaphors, and he doesn't just tell it one time, he'll go back through. So some people like to take the whole book of Revelation as if it's like in a timeline, in a sequential time, but he tells the same story over and over, just like Daniel does. All of the last 7 chapters of Daniel tell the same cycle over and over, and so we learn a lot from how to read the book of Revelation by reading Daniel as a metaphor for the Maccabean War. We understand how he uses symbols, prophetic symbols, and he's speaking encouragement to them. We also understand the book of Revelation by reading other apocalypses. So I've mentioned before that Revelation wasn't the only apocalypse. There were some apocalypses that did not make it into the Bible. There's Jubilees. The one that I go to the most is the book of 1 Enoch. I've talked about this last week. It's like 108 chapters long. Some of it's very old. Some of it might be 200 BC. We found copies of it at the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we know it was originally written in Aramaic, but we only have pieces of it. The only complete copy of it is in Ethiopic. So it's in this, which is a Semitic language in Ethiopia. But so for example, just for you to listen to how another apocalypse that has nothing to do with Rome or anything like that, this apocalypse is basically written about angels falling from heaven, which is why the Jewish rabbis didn't include it in the Old Testament, because in Jewish theology, angels can't sin and be kicked out of heaven. So that didn't make sense to them. But in Enoch, they sure could. And they abandoned their posts, and they taught people how to wear makeup and make war against each other and, awful things like that. And so they got kicked out, and he says, and then I saw 7 stars. Does that sound familiar? And a great burning mountains. And to me, when I inquired about them, the angel said, this place is the end of heaven and earth. And this has become the prison of the stars of the host of heaven, and the stars which roll over the fire, and those which have transgressed the command of life, or the command of the Lord, of the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth at their appointed time. And so this is the story of the angels and their rebellion in heaven, but it uses 7 stars and it uses a burning mountain. And so these were common phrases. These were the tools of the apocalyptic literature, right? These were, and we don't have much of this kind of apocalyptic language prior to this or since. At least I don't know much of it. What would you compare it to? Modern art, free jazz, something like that. It's a very unique, small window of time in Jewish literature where they wrote like this. And so part of why I read other comparative literatures, it helps me to learn how to listen to it, right? What am I listening to here? All right. And he says, and I heard an eagle. Oh man, there's the aquila again. So you remember every legion had an aquila, a long pole with a golden eagle on the top of it. And it was like their capture the flag. If you lose the aquila, it's all over. You will go to war to get the aquila back. It was your very honor. If it was heard in the empire that you lost your aquila, it was it. And right before this war broke out, the reason that Nero sent Vespasian and Titus to quell this rebellion is because the Jews headed off General Gallus in the valley of Beth Horon and defeated a bunch of them and stole their aquila. That's what started the war. And so eagles are going to come up a lot in this. Flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, 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 for those who dwell in the land. Because of the other voices, the trumpets of the three angels which are yet to sound. And the last three are the really bad ones. That's next week. So I have about 10 minutes because we're going to end a little early tonight because the youth are going to set up or tear down all these chairs and put them away. So let's just take a few minutes if we can. Does anybody have any questions? Y'all got it down now? Memorized the chart and all that stuff? Next week is really a good one. It's going to be, but I like all of it. Do you enjoy this book? I think it's much more edifying and entertaining if I'm not reading it scared to death of what I'm going to go through, right? If I read it as a book of encouragement. And what he's explaining is he's saying, listen, I know you've gone through something traumatic, and he's explaining all of these things that are happening, and they're seeing all of this image and stuff like that. The people that were in the church that first heard this, they knew what he was talking about. He was basically giving a spiritual language to the trauma that they experienced, saying this is what it felt like to be in Israel when the Romans attacked. It was just absolutely overwhelming, and we lost so many people, and he's writing it to the survivors. And so they're like, yeah. And eventually he says, remember, those people gathered around the throne, those are those that lost their life in the Great Tribulation. He's saying, good, because that was Aunt Martha and Uncle, and they're not lost. They're going to be there in heaven when we get there someday. So amazing book. I hope you like it. Thank you for coming to Revelation Appreciation class. We just talk about the most underestimated and underappreciated book in the Bible. So hopefully by the time you're done with it, it'll still be mysterious, but it won't be as scary. All right. Take a minute, would you, before the kids come in, and find somebody tonight, find a prayer partner or two, and share with somebody what's your takeaway from tonight, or what's the thing that really struck you tonight. And if somebody needs prayer, pray for them, all right? Lord bless you. Thank you for coming.